Okay, everyone, welcome along. I can't see myself, so hopefully I'm in screen somewhere, but I'm upstairs in my office here on a nice rainy night in Cambridge. So, how good? What better to do than talk about native trees all night? So, we will get the webinar underway. And basically, if you've got any questions as you go through, there's a little button there where you can interact. I think it's a Q&A button. If you tap on that, Claire's actually here capturing those questions for me, and she's going to run them over on a bit of paper, and I'll answer them most likely toward the end. So yeah, just hit with the Q&A and say, hey, Adam, why are you saying these crazy things? What do you mean by that? And we'll answer any questions. Annette's in the background pushing the buttons, so hopefully if anything goes too far wrong, we'll sort it out. But we'll get started. So tonight really is all about talking about planning a native planting project. So we'll talk a little bit about me just for a quick start. For those of you who don't know me, possibly see me as the crazy guy on socials with the phone up saying really crazy things about trees, always being fired up about something going on. So I own a farm here at Cambridge, about 100 hectares, run beef and mainly lots of native trees. I'm pretty excited about that. Our nursery's based here. So we grow a lot of trees. I'm really passionate about conservation. So spend a lot of my off time in the bush, trapping, hanging out with birds, taking the kids out and enjoying nature. So yeah, my ambition really is around making it easy to restore native biodiversity back onto farms all over New Zealand. So that's why I've founded Restore Native, and that's why I get fired up about talking about things like we are tonight. So we'll go on to talk a little bit more about our vision. We'll just play this quick video, and that'll tell that story a little bit better than maybe I said it then, and we'll get on with the next bit. You hear that? Cool. So that's Restore Native. Oh, no sound on the video. Oh, a little bit of a technical glitch. Sorry there, Andrea. Thanks for pointing that out. Uh, we'll send the link out for that tomorrow, and we've got another video to play later. So maybe if we've got a sound issue, it all worked in trial today, but we'll send these out so you've got them anyway. You've got the videos to watch. No worries. So who are we? So we're based in the Waikato. A nursery grows about 1 million plants each year. We specialise, so we only grow natives, and really we're specialising in hardy plants to primarily be the first generation colonisers in revegetating on unproductive farmland. So we're focusing on steep hillsides, riparian, wetlands, those sorts of things. We do a number of larger trees as well, but yeah, mainly focusing out there practical solutions on farm. So one of my big reasons in terms of starting the nursery was actually to try and break down this constant increasing of cost. What was I saying there? There we go. So yeah, cost being a big factor, I think, for a lot of people with their planning projects. So it's great when there's a bit of funding out there, but that's not always reliable. We know what the funding cycles of councils and whatnot are like. So we're trying to do high volume and try and keep the cost reasonable. We deliver plants out all across the North Island. So just this week we had plants going down as far as Wairarapa, into the King Country Bay, plenty anywhere around. And then we offer a full service basically within an hour and a half of our Cambridge base. So that covers most of the Waikato, Bay of Plenty, King Country, etc. So we'll do planning when we come out, map sites, help find the right tree in the right place. We do spraying, whether that's weed control to prepare sites or maintenance for plants, and then obviously take care of the planting and the supply of the plants as well. So really proud of my team. Like, little photo there was sort of a bit of an interesting bunch of varied backgrounds, but people are just really passionate out there to get out and work with plants and get out what we call a bit of type 2 fun when you're out on days like today, freezing cold and the rain planting trees. So yeah, we're pretty fired up about it. Cool. So, what are we going to talk about tonight? So, three simple things, really. Identification of your site, so choosing the site and planning in terms of how you're going to plant it. Um, Selecting the right plants for that particular site, and that's really important when you consider those the first thing and how that actually ties in as well. And then preparing your site ready for planting. So these are all the planning parts. We're going to run another webinar at the end of next month, which is going to be all about planting, correct distribution throughout your site, different grades of plants, etc. But we'll focus on these three key things today. If any of you came to my last webinar, we tried to cover too many things, and I was talking for about an hour and a half about trees, and everyone got a bit sick of it. So anyway, let's get on. So identification. So there's three photos there, which I think illustrate areas that people are looking to do planting or would benefit from doing planting, and the reasons why you might go and do planting. So it's really important to start there, not just a case of, oh, I should plant some trees. It's why am I actually doing this? What are the reasons to do it? It might be for all four of these reasons listed here, but specifically on each site, you might go, cool, this is a really prominent area that I see a lot from my house or when I'm bringing the cows to the cow shed. I want it to look beautiful. And that's going to help shape your goals and how you present that going forward. Water quality is really important. We can see one there's got a creek running through it, another one on the side of a pond. Now, if you're getting erosion into those areas or stock near them, we want to actually put a buffer in and plant specific plants to make sure that we're achieving good sort of water quality outcomes. And then we were on to really steep sites. That one in the middle, it doesn't show up that great in the photo, but it's that classic sort of Arapuni sort of river terrace land where it's really steep, flat up top, and then really steep down the side. So that's really erosion risk when you've got cattle on those types of areas, and that's a reason to do it. And then biodiversity. So I'm a bit of a bird nerd. I love bringing back birds into these plantings, and I think it's really cool for people to connect with nature through that. As you get deeper into it, there are all kinds of other things that live in a forest. There's wetters and lizards and all these sorts of things. So there are many reasons why you plant, but I think it's really good to take the time and go, cool, why do I want to do this planting? And why is this area, why am I going to plant this area? And that's how we can build on it from there. So, and as we move on, drone mapping. So an important part for us of that planning stage. So in terms of selecting sites and planning, we think drone mapping is a real key part to that. It's been a game changer for the way that we actually approach planning on planting sites. Because the old trick, I couldn't believe it when I started out in this sort of 7 or 8 years ago. You come along from some old map and you go, oh, you might be about half a hectare. Oh yeah, that might be 1,000 plants and good enough. And oftentimes what happened is people got to the end of their planting and they either didn't have enough plants, so they spread them out too far and they didn't do very well, or they had too many plants and they packed them in too tight and then it looked silly. So by getting out and drone mapping, we can accurately, fly over an area, plot it like this blue polygon in this example here, and then you can see the flat area. So on the side it says area, and then it says surface area. So area is if mapped flat, and the surface area is the actual land that's going to be planted. So you can see how you can get quite a variation on a slope where you can actually wind up with 20-30% more land that actually needs planted. So if you want to get a good density and you want to achieve sort of coverage in your planting, it starts with planning and getting the accuracy right there, and then you can plan your numbers. So surface area consideration of slope's important. And then getting the right density. If you say you want to put plants in at 2 meters, well, you need to make sure you've got the exact right number to get them in at 2 meters and not sort of near enough's good enough. Because I think in the past, a few sort of people have planted native projects and just sort of hoped for the best. And then had some pretty average results in terms of survival and other outcomes. And it's a really key area there. So the other thing I love about it, it gives you a really cool before photo. We're permanently changing the landscape on our farms when we're putting these trees in. And when you see these sort of degraded, slipping hillsides, and then you see them come back then afterwards a beautiful native forest, it's really cool to capture that work we're doing and remind ourselves while we're doing it. So planning out of an area. So this is the head of a valley we planted last year. So it was about 3.5 hectares, quite large. and it just sort of encompasses a lot of the types of areas that you would be planting. This was sort of a bit of a wasteland on a dairy farm, very wet in the bottom, steep hillsides that the cows sort of, did a lot of erosion damage on. But it had some cool existing vegetation. So it's a prime example when we talk about identifying those areas and what you're doing. So complementing local vegetation is a really good one. In this particular site here, along the right-hand side of the gully, you can see there's actually some old tōtara, mainly tōtara, some kahikatea that were remnants along there. So obviously one time would have been a forest, now a bit disparate with grass underneath. In the area, there were other sort of good native plants. This is down in Wotu, so there's some beautiful bush reserves in there, and we're able to see what was thriving in the area in terms of returning shrubs back there and what was going to grow well. Then in the bottom, very wet. There were some swamp grasses present further down the gully, and so we knew what was going to come back in well. So there's no point sort of reinventing the wheel or thinking that one size fits all in terms of a species mix. It really is about identifying what's going to work for that site well, to build yourself a really good long-term project. So and this one, again, coming back to the reasons why, and the reasons why were numerous for these guys. They actually put a pond in there at the end, so it was recreation, water quality. So through the middle and through the bottom of this gully, they've actually carved a channel there, which sort of directed the flow in what was already a wet area. And that allowed a filtration, sort of a wetland filtration planting to go in through that, which was able to catch a lot of the catchment off their dairy farm and actually filter that water before it left. In a really simple term, it wasn't a case of major design, but actually just working with nature. And then obviously protecting the erosion from this gully as well. And at that size, at 3.5 hectares with adjoining bush, beautiful picture of Magatotiri there in the background, you can just see the benefits of biodiversity. So everything on this site, but we're looking at, say, just a riparian site alongside a waterway. You might be going, cool. What's really important here is erosion control, that we keep the bank from eroding, and we want to protect our water quality. And we go, great. We can target those two things by doing these things here, and that's quite important. Plant density is a big one, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go on. But often that is like, how quickly do you want that site to have full coverage? If we did nothing in these areas, or we planted, just a handful of trees, in 50 or 100 years, we would be returning primarily to native. In the meantime, it'd be mainly blackberry, gorse, other things like that would come through, and then eventually the natives would start to win. And really anywhere from packing down to density where we can guarantee sort of, trees touching each other and good site coverage within sort of 3 years. So it really depends on how much we spend, what that site coverage is going to be and how quickly it's going to happen. Site preparation is the final thing. So, fencing's an obvious one. When you're looking at areas, called practical places to put fences, an area like this where they're putting a pond in, a little bit of long-term planning with that is good. But yeah, establishing what you need to make your site work. And that's different with every site, and that's where the planning piece comes in as well. Bear with me a second, I'm just going to blow my nose. I'm back. Beautiful. Cool. So selecting the right plants. This is, I think, yeah, one of the very most important things. Again, there's not a one size fits all thing here. We are primarily using mixes of similar plants, which are the established colonizing plants that actually get you started when you're planting a sort of bare paddock area. But it's really important to identify what the right plants for your property are, and then mixing them across the site correctly as well. So we've got a really good example coming up on the next slide of how that's been done on a larger scale. But that also applies on any sort of scale and small plantings on lifestyle blocks or farms as well. So let's have a bit of a look at that, and then we'll be able to sort of talk through it a bit better. So this here is a big gully that we planted out on the fringes of Magatotiri, sort of Hicks Road. So we're looking sort of north towards Cambridge from here. Now, a really good example of the colonizing species we use there. So these are the plants that went in on day one when we planted. So really hardy species. So we look at things like Aki, Manuka, Kanuka, the Pittosporums. They're hardy species that grow fast and they get in and provide cover. And then in those colonizing species, we've also got hardy things that fruit. So that's where the cabbage trees, flaxes for their feeding birds, but the karamu, the wineberry and the mahoe come in really well. is that those trees are fruiting, and that means the birds that are flying out over the fence of Maungatautari or from any bush remnant nearby are going to come and feed on the fruits of those trees, and they're going to start dispersing seeds, and then we're going to get that natural regeneration. So it's important that we get a mix of hardy species in, but also something that the birds will come to. And this is where, just wholesale manuka planting doesn't actually give a long-term fix. And although it's a hardy plant, the birds got no reason to go to it, and then we can't get into the sort of natural cycle of regeneration. But it's an important plant to be a part of that initial establishment, because you can't just plant in there things like Rimu and Miro, for example, because they won't survive totally out in the open. It's not how they naturally grow. So we came back to this project here 2 or 3 years after it was planted, and went in and dotted through some enrichment species. So things like Kikatea, Kōwhai, Raurewa, Titoki, Tōtara, Rimu, Miro, etc., all went in under the canopy that was forming sort of around this time here. So that's good. Andrew's just had a really good question. What would I suggest planting instead of Manuka? Do you want to go back to that one, Annette, to the previous one? So instead of Manuka, it's not about not just planting Manuka, it's about getting diversity in there. Andrea, thanks for your question. Oh, no, instead of Karamu. No Karamu. Okay, so fruiting species. We might, I'll come back to you on that. If you just want to elaborate on that a little bit, I might just actually answer that at the end, Andrea, and we have a bit more of a chat about it. But yeah, fruiting species are key to get the birds cycling through. And if not, you don't have to have every single one of these. So, Karamu is an autumn fruiter. Maho is a late summer, early autumn fruiter. Wineberry is an autumn fruiter. Cabbage tree is an autumn fruiter. So, you don't have to have every single one of them, but having some mix of those fruiting species means you're providing food for the birds and things to move on from there. So we'll go on to the next one. So planting across a slope, right tree, right place. So when we talk about getting your mix right in terms of planning how these trees are going to go is actually really important. So, this is a basic drawing, talking about planting, near a creek or a drain or what have you. So, on the edges of that drain, we've got things like sedges, so grasses, carex grasses that we think of, umbrella sedges, and then you move out a bit of a layer from the edge of the water and you go to your toys and flaxes, and then into your cabbage trees and ribbonwoods and the like. And then as you get a little bit further away, you're into your shrubs. So it's important on any site where there's sort of, especially if you've got water courses, but any site where there's sort of dry to damp, that you're getting a balance of your trees across it well. So again, it's not about just sort of, I'll have 100 of each of those trees on the list. It's about, great, we've got more dry areas. We're going to need more Kānuka and Akiaki for that. We've got more wet areas here. We're going to need more grasses, cabbages, flaxes for those. So this is a really good diagram, which is readily available online. If you look at sort of, we can actually have a reference to that in screen grab it there, or we can tell you. And it's a really good diagram to give you an example of what it's like planting sort of any site, And if we look back to the gully that we're looking at before, we very much planted it in that way of sort of drier things further up, a lot of Kānuka on the sides, and then we sort of moved into the wetter species as we came down the hill. So now I think we'll try this and we'll see if we can get the audio to run on it. I actually can't hear that at all. Someone just comment if you can't hear it. Can you hear it? Okay, that sounds not working. Sorry. We'll can that and it. So if we just go to that slide without playing the video. So what I'm talking about there, in that slide, please, Annette, the one with the video, please. What I'm talking about in that video is the density of plants. So you can see sort of where I'm standing. These are trees that are about 4 years old, I think, as I sit there. And they were planted at about 2 meter spacing. So I'm sort of walking through a bit of grass in between them. And at 4 years old, they're not yet quite touching each other. And that's at about a 2 meter spacing. We'll often plant into about a 1.5 meter spacing to get an optimal sort of growth. And then after about 3 years, you'll actually those trees will be touching each other. They'll be starting to shade out the ground, and that's where the sort of the regeneration can start to come in. So, plant density is a real consideration when you're doing your planning, and it really comes down to the cost, which we'll talk about a little bit in this next one. We're talking about sizes of plants and the density in terms of how that impacts the cost of your project. So a photo here where I've got a not very friendly look on my face, snapped off a video, but a bit of an example here of sort of three grades that we grow. There are slightly larger grades, there are slightly smaller grades, but it gives you a rough idea of the size of the plants. All three of these are all wineberry, and it just sort of shows the cell size and the height roughly that they are. So this is an important consideration in terms of cost of your project, is how big are the plants you're putting in. It's a little bit, I say it's a bit of a religious sort of question because some people sort of swear by a certain size and that's the only way to do it. And I've had some really clever people tell me that you must put in large grade, and some really clever people tell me you must put in really small grades. They've actually both got their merits, but it depends on the site and the budget and what you're actually trying to achieve. So, for example, we did some planting recently on an organic farm, and we needed to get up and beat the grass because we didn't have spray options. So we put in a larger grade plant for them, which meant that, that tree was already ahead of the grass and it wasn't going to get so much competition. They suffer a little bit more transplant shock at that size, but we mitigated that by putting a slow release fertilizer tab in it. So that was an option. And in terms of the total overall cost without doing any spraying and whatnot, they actually got a pretty good result by putting in a larger tree, all things considered. What we call our standard grade, our 28 cell or the half litre, that's sort of pretty much an industry standard for revegetation planting. 80% of what we do is in that size. And with a good pre-spray and a bit of a release follow-up, it's the most economical way to establish a forest. And then the medium grade there, the 40 cell, we do those in just a few really hardy species. We do a lot of Manuka and Kanuka and sort of larger scale afforestation programs. We're doing a lot of work for the council doing these. Where they're going sort of wide spacings across large areas where they're looking at maybe getting a canopy coverage in 10 years or so. A very low cost option. They're obviously a smaller plant, they're easier to plant, they're cheaper to grow, but it doesn't suit everything. You can't plant sort of sensitive trees in that smaller grade. So what grade is right for you? Well, it depends on the site. So if you've got a site which is quite challenging, there's a lot of weed pressure or there's going to be a lot of strong grass pressure coming up and you've got the budget to go for a larger grade, it's worthwhile. But if you've got a relatively clean site, relatively good conditions, putting that standard grade through is going to be a good economical way of establishing. And if you've got a low budget and you just, you want to get something out there, then the 40 cell sort of medium grade's a good option. The other thing I talk about there on the right-hand side is spacing. So, you know, ideal spacing is somewhere between that 1.5 to 2 meter spacing to get a good coverage in that sort of 3 to 5 years, depending on which end of that spacing you are, so that you get coverage, trees touching, forming a canopy, and then you're not getting weed incursion through those areas. And you're getting good, strong growth out of the plants. Natives are not like exotics. You can go and plant a pine tree 10 meters apart from another pine tree and it'll grow just fine. But natives are different in terms of the way that they actually need a little bit of support from each other, planted in groups. Any spacing out sort of beyond 2.5 meters, you tend to get a lot of losses in those planting programs if they're not well sheltered. So we tend to steer clear of that on the type of country that we're working with here in the Waikato. So, but obviously it impacts your cost. If you're going for that medium grade, at a 2 meter spacing, it's around $10,000 a hectare. If you're going for large grade with really high density, it's $25,000 plus. So, it really depends on what your budget is and what you want to achieve. They all represent reasonable value for money at their size, but it depends what your budget is and how much you want to achieve, how quickly you want it to look good, and what your other long-term goals are. So yeah, that's plant sizing. Hit me with some questions on that. I really, yeah, it's a fun one because everyone's got a personal opinion on it, but always happy to ask questions on, yeah, which one fits where. Now, preparing your site. So this is a really important one. you've only got one chance to do it to prepare well. It's like laying a foundation for a house. If you rush into areas with existing weed issues and you just sort of chuck trees in and hope for the best, all of a sudden your chemical control, weapons in your toolbox basically disappear because you can't spray brush killer, to kill things like convolvulus and blackberry and gorse and that through your existing native plants. So preparing often, a season or two ahead for those areas that have a bit of weed infestation, is actually really important. We spend a lot of our summers out there on sort of, often quite rough hill country or sort of forgotten gullies that have had a fence around them and haven't been grazed and therefore blackberry and stuff have come back through them. We spend a lot of time spraying those through the summer to make sure that we've actually killed all of the weeds out of them so that they are ready for planting. We've got a good slide coming up next where you see what happens if you don't. So on the right hand side here is it's a manuka or kanuka, I can't quite tell on my small screen, and that's got convolvulus growing all over it. So this was a site where the creek side, and we often get convolvulus around creek areas, had been fenced off for a couple of years, and some funding came along for the council. People jumped at it, threw their trees in without doing any weed control. Next summer, convolvulus back really bad, smothered a whole lot of plants. We're in there sort of 3 years later, and the survival was around about 1/3 of the plants were still alive, and the ones that were getting crawled over with convolvulus non-stop. So you only, yeah, again, the preparation is key in terms of that weed control. And you only get one chance to do it right because otherwise, once those trees go in, you can't control those weeds quite the same. And that's where the plant density thing comes in too, is if you've got, if you're in an area which has a lot of gorse or has a lot of blackberry, even if you clean up your site, it's going to come back in. If you have sort of wide spacings between your plants, every area in between is an opportunity for a weed to pop up. But as soon as those trees can touch each other and shade out those weeds underneath, the weed problem just goes away. So now, on the left-hand side here, we've got a well spot sprayed gully. Trees in there spaced at about 1.5 metre centres. So coming back in 3 years after this, that area there is going to have really good coverage. Trees most likely all touching each other, and away it goes. So we've chosen a spot spray there to make sure we get an absolute best site prep. And we actually spot spray with glyphosate and a product called Turb, which gives a long knockdown. And it's a bit of a pre-emergent in the fact that seeds in that don't germinate in it for around 3 months. So you get a bit of knockdown coming into the spring where the grass isn't just immediately rushing back over your trees like it can if you use glyphosate alone. We try not to spray a huge spot. Ideally, that spot is sort of around about 600 millimeters in diameter, provides a well there for the tree to go in with no competition and then get away. But again, it depends on your site. If you've got a really clean site, you want to reduce the cost, you can actually just graze hard before planting, and there's no reason why actually a hard graze doesn't work. It's just that it often means that come springtime, that grass is sort of racing away again. And then on that other end, when you need to go and do your spring maintenance, you can actually lose trees under the grass that's raced away if you don't absolutely time your spot spraying to perfection. So yeah, so that's the examples around site preparation. We will spot spray 80 to 90% of our plantings we do. Again, just to make sure we've got the absolute best result in terms of getting those trees off to the best start. So great. Here we are. We've come to the end for tonight. So I will go through a bit of a Q&A. I've got a few questions sitting in front of me, but if you've got any other questions, just fire them onto that Q&A button now, and Claire will bring them through. We'll be running another webinar in a month, and that is the practical tips on planting. So that's everything around the actual planting process, spades versus augers, how do you plant just a smaller grade versus a larger grade, laying your plants out across the site, all those sorts of things. So we'll get that sorted next month. We'll spend a bit more time in detail, rather than sort of boring you for an hour at a time. We thought we'd just break them down. So I'll pick up some of these questions in front of me now and see what I can do to help. So what do we got here? We have a lifestyle block that's planted on a range of trees south of Lake Taupo. Frost has killed off all the karamu. What can we plant instead? Yes, this is Andrew from earlier. Appreciate that. Frost sensitivity is a hard one in terms of fruiting plants. A lot of fruiting plants actually start off, under a bit of coverage and canopy. So probably the best thing is if you are going to plant, it might not be that karamu is the issue. It might be looking at where they can actually be planted in a bit of shade from the frost. So hopefully, as time's gone by, your likes of your pittosporums and your manuka and those other things have grown and provided a bit of coverage, and then you can sort of start to bed these fruiting trees in sort of in and under them. But with that coverage as well, it's probably a time to be looking at moving towards enrichment planting. So, you know, that might be a case of, depending on your site, kakatea, tōtara, very hardy, long-lived trees that are fruiting as well, and good options to sort of bring in at that point. But yeah, often, if you've got frost killing things out, we did a couple of projects in Tihoi last year, and in that winter, some of those sensitive species can get really hammered. So it was relying on those things like manuka and kanuka that are hardy, the pittosporums, and then getting other trees sort of to establish under them once they've actually started off. So, how much time between spraying and planting? Yep, no, that's a great question. Realistically, you can actually, if you're just spraying with glyphosate, you can plant on the day that you sprayed. There's no sort of issue with a product like that. With our turb, we've got about a 1 month wait point, which actually works out really well because the spots you saw in that clip earlier in that photo, they're about a month to 6 weeks, and they're just sort of perfectly dead, really visible. You can go and put your tree right in the middle of that spot, and away they go. So we sort of recommend around that month. Spraying though for some of the brush kill chemicals, so metsulfuron, picloram especially. So your products like Conquest, Tripic, some of the Tordons, they'll have sort of 3 months for most of them. Some are up to 6 months in terms of brush killing before you can go and put some trees back into it. So it is important to get that weed control done more like January, February than sort of March, April, just to make sure you can actually give a good 3 months so that the residuals from those brush killers are out of the soil, because they're trying to kill the very type of plants we're trying to establish. What would recommend on plant sizing in high wind zones? And also those with vigorous roots like karamu. Yeah, cool. Yeah, we do a lot of planting. Obviously, you can imagine the areas we're planting are not the most productive farmland in the world. So, a few of our coastal sites, you're looking for hard stemmed plants. You want fast growth, but you want things that are going fast roots, fast top. Some plants will just rush away on top and actually, relatively weaken the roots. Things like akiaki, for example, really hard stem plant, but planted on exposed sites, they can actually get a bit top heavy and snap over. So really, we tend to lean on in those areas. Manuka, Kanuka, cabbage tree is a great one. Really good underground root establishment. If you're a windy area that's a little bit damper, things like ribbonwood are really good. The pittosporums, both tenifolium and lemonwood, are generally pretty good in those high wind areas as well. They're hardy growth, but they're not sort of too much on top and getting themselves into trouble. So every site's a little bit different. By all means, you can just flick me an email with some photos of where you are, and I can give you a bit of advice specifically to you. But you can also learn a lot around like what else is growing in the area. You have a look at something that someone else has planted or what you've planted that's going well, and you go, cool, there's one. Because that can often change, with impacts like, if you're a little bit coastal, there can be a little bit of salt spray. Things can do a little bit better. In areas where it's really wet, other things will do better. So it gives you a bit of an idea. Okay, if beautification is of a high priority, are there certain species you would avoid or use more of? And also, are there species you would choose that would work as a barrier around the edges of a planting zone? Yeah, that's really good chat. I really like your thinking there, Jess. It's a good question. Yeah, beautification. So this is a real in the eye of the beholder, I guess. I have this debate where I've got a couple of really passionate farmers who are sort of ongoing planting, and they've all got their tree that they love. Mine personally is, say, puriri, for example. It's a strong fruiter and flower. It goes year round, big glossy leaves. So we're recreating a forest, but we're recreating it in the eyes of what we think a forest should look like. So ultimately, the big superstar trees are things that take a long time to grow, generally. So, you can't just have a sort of 20-meter tall remu overnight, but I think that'd be an epic forest. The different types of foliage, if you like that. But for me, it's the more glossier leaf, big fruiters and flowers, it's pūrere and tea talkie especially, and we're starting to see tea talkie used a lot more in sort of landscaping and new subdivisions. We're selling a lot of trees into those sort of areas that are tea talkie, for example, because they're a beautiful tree, glossy leaves, big fruit, birds come at them. So I think that's a really good one. And in planning those, it's planning how you're going to interact with them. So it's not about, 50% of your mix being pūrere. It's about going, cool, well, this is how I'm going to drive around that area. So I want to have a pūrere dotted every 5 meters around the edge that I'm driving, or I'm going to have a walkway through it, or whatnot. And you put these trees in the places that you're going to interact with them most. I think those are the big things is our relationship with the forest because it comes out of our brain, it grows and evolves, and then we sort of interact with it. So I think that's a really good way of planning. And trees around the edge. Look, we use manuka as a sacrifice tree a lot. We've got work with clients who are looking to do long-term forestry with natives, so planting tōtara and the likes into it. And we'll use manuka as a tree just to protect from everything that's coming at it, because it's probably the hardiest sort of growing tree. But if we interplant that with some of those long-lived trees and those important ecological fruiting trees, the manuka can either be cut down at a later date, or it can stay there on the fringe protecting until these other trees get really well established and eventually shaded out. So Marnook is only going to sort of, 5, 8 meters, depending on the part of your country you're in. So eventually those big trees, the Rauroa, Kakatea, those sort of things are going to shade it out. And I think that's really the place that we should be using Manuka rather than necessarily planting a whole hillside of just Manuka. We should be using it as a nurse crop for those larger trees. Really good question. How long had that been planted for the enrichment stage? Sorry, I didn't catch that one earlier, Debbie. I think you're talking about the Magatotiri one. Um, so that was, I think, 2 years in some parts, 3 years in others before we put enrichment in. Although in one of the later stages of that, and something we do actually do quite often now, is we actually put in Kahikatea and Tōtara as we planted, because they just in most sites, they're not going to be impacted by the exposure. If they're, say, for example, if you've got a sheltered site that's a little bit damp, Kahikatea, you can actually put it in with the rest of your shrubs and it'll grow just fine. Tōtara, again, especially on hillsides, it tends to compete really well. But otherwise, you're looking into that sort of, 2, 3, 4 years, depending on what your spacings of your other plants are, until they've got enough sort of size on to give a little bit of shelter. And then, you're always going to lose some trees in a planting block. So it's about getting in between those trees, getting in the enrichment trees at that point where you can sort of still move through the block well. And to Jess's point earlier, actually just spending some time putting those trees in the areas that you're going to benefit from seeing them because, you interact with them better and create a forest in your own vision, which is cool. So, what's my view on eco sourcing when we deliver across the Waikato? Yeah, another really quite religious point in terms of some people are real hardcore on eco sourcing. Things absolutely must come from the same area they've grown in. And it's a fascinating one because again, we deal with a lot of ecologists and some really sort of hotshot scientists, and my belief is sort of and some of the larger trees, some of the longer lived trees, I try and eco source them as much as possible. We eco source primarily 80% of what we grow from, within sort of 20 k's of our nursery. But there are some things which are just not occurring very well, like locally. Things like pittosporums, for example, not particularly viable seed, not really good established local populations. They've all been interspersed with sort of everyone planting a backyard hedge. So yeah, we don't get too caught up on the eco sourcing thing. We've also got a changing climate, so I'm planting pūrere and tarairi and things like that here on my farm, which are primarily coastal and northland trees. So who knows in 20 or 30 years when those are mature trees, what the climate here is going to be like. It's a hard question to answer. But ultimately, for a lot of the colonizing trees we're growing, they're going to live a life of 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And then those forest giants are going to come through and shade them out. So, the ultimate forest is still going to be eco-sourced in its own way. But we select more on things like, hardy, good representation of the variety. We're not into sort of, picking around for fancy colors and things like that. We're trying to grow things that actually just grow really hard when they get out there. Um, Out and about. Not everyone's point of view, but yeah, it's again a very across very clever people, very divided spectrum. Where's a good place to look for info around what species that are natural to a location? keeping what's been there. Yeah, no, fair enough. Um, it's a really hard one. We're actually doing growing some special trees for a client in Taranaki that are a very locally rare tree to that particular area that they only found out by chance at a conversation at the pub or something like that. Anyway, that they were talking to someone. They said, "Oh, I've got this weird tree at the back of my place," and they realised that actually it used to be in these drawings of when local Māori were there, and so they're trying to spread that back through their region. There isn't what we learnt in that. It was actually really hard to go back and find what used to be here. But that said, in most areas, there are still some fairly original reserves that you can go and visit that will have good species in. And we get a bit carried away up on, we need to put the right species in for our, when we just go and do our first planting today. It probably doesn't matter if you go and put a manuka in to get something established, if ultimately you want to create a kakatea forest, because the kakatea is going to outlive the manuka by hundreds of years. And if you're using the local kakatea from your area, say for example, because it's a dominant species, then you can create it like that. So um, to answer your question, there's no really reliable resource on knowing what's out there, except for getting out on your feet and getting around to the local reserves, looking at the plants, using a plant ID app, looking around what's growing around the fringes of the forest in terms of what's regenerating well. But also looking at what the big long-lived trees are, because those are the things that you ultimately want to get into your block over time to create a really big, lovely long-term forest. So yeah, it's a good one. Conversation I'm always willing to have too in terms of the different areas because I have most amazing people message me who are really passionate about. Hey, I was out on a walk and we get people who drop seeds into the nursery too. I was on a walk and I found this tree and it was fruiting and I've never seen it before and which is really cool because we're a community of people who are passionate about that ultimate end goal of improving biodiversity and doing it through planting wonderful trees. So that looks like about it in terms of Q&A tonight. So thanks everyone for asking your questions. I really appreciate it. It's really cool actually having a bit of interaction from people out there. I spend my time talking to a screen. Um, there's a bit of a QR code up there if you want to scan that. That takes you directly to our website, to our blog. And it's got a bunch of frequently asked questions in terms of all the stuff for planting and anything that I've sort of had thrown at me a number of times I try and put on there. I've recorded a bunch of videos that can answer a heap of questions so that you sort of know yeah, can learn a little bit more as we go. So, and my details were there on that last page. So just adam at restorenative.co.nz. Send me an email. Yeah, I'd love a bit of chat on, hey, this is what I'm doing, or this is what I'd like to do. And what do you think about this? Yeah, at the end of the day, I'm a pretty passionate guy about trees and just want to sort of help people along the way. So yeah, we'll just keep in touch. But obviously, tell your friends, come back next month. We can talk about planting trees. But for tonight, good night.